Good morning, everyone. Okay, that works perfect. Can you hear me well? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Seid event, Navigating Ocean Finance, Investing in a Sustainable Blue Future. Hard to say. My name is Marine Lecerf, and I'm the head of international policy at the Ocean and Climate Platform, and I have the utmost pleasure of being your moderator today. But before we dive in, let me just take the time to thank the co-organizers for this session. So we have the Climate Champions team, the Global Ocean Trust, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, obviously the Ocean and Climate Platform, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, and last but not least, the the United Nations Global Compact. So thank you to our co-organizers. But now, this is quite a long list, and since time is limited, I suggest that we dive right in. As you know, many of us were together in Dubai last year for the first ever global stocktake, which concluded with a very sobering message. We're not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and the window of opportunity to course correct is rapidly closing. But the good news is that the global stocktake is more than just an assessment, and it also laid out the way forward to get our climate trajectory back on track. Among the key findings, the global stocktake clearly identified the ocean as an integral part of the solution and even invited states to strengthen ocean-based climate measures. So really realizing that there is a climate mitigation and adaptation potential there. It is now time for parties to act on these findings by submitting new and more ambitious NDCs by February 2025 on the road to COP30. And this also means integrating new ocean measures, or at least reinforcing those that are already there. Because while we have seen encouraging progress with more and more countries integrating these solutions in their strategies, these measures still remain clearly underrepresented. And this is particularly true actually for the mitigation options, such as deploying offshore wind energy of green shipping. But countries' ability to raise their ambition in upcoming NDCs and also the successful implementation of these very commitments largely depend on the availability of resources, including finance. And this is also the reason why so many of us are in the room today or here in Baku. When adopting the Paris Agreement, developed countries also committed to providing 100 billion US dollars every year by 2020 to support developing countries' efforts. And they also, and this is important, agreed to revise this goal by 2025. So the so-called new collective quantified goal for climate action is supposed to deliver on the finance we need for the NDCs we want. And after 2 years of negotiations and discussions, key questions still remain unresolved, such as the amount of this target or who should contribute. And we're not here in the negotiations room, but we know how difficult it is right now out there. The technical process over these past 2 years has not really devoted any significant time unpacking ocean-related or even nature-related climate finance. And of course, this is understandable because much of the debate remains at this macro level, and it's actually unlikely that it's become any more granular at this level. But it's really important to ensure that these ocean and nature sectors also benefit from this increase of climate finance. So the way I see it is we're now standing at the crossroads. COP28 was the stop sign where we had to stop and reflect on the past 10 years of climate action, hopefully learning from them as well. COP29 is a crossroads where the choices converge, path towards effective implementation and hopefully sustainability, and on the other hand, less action or inaction. COP30 is the road that leads to living in harmony with nature if we manage to really steer decisively. And for that, as highlighted in the global stocktake, we really need to make sure ocean is part of the discussion. And that is why, and I forgot to change the slide, but it's okay because I introduced myself. We published with the Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, ORRAA, sorry, I always use the acronym, and key partners, a policy brief providing concrete recommendations for parties to really consider the oceans and the solutions it provides in this so-called NCQG and the different finance-related processes, including the discussion on loss and damage and the discussion on Article 6. And I'm actually taking a few minutes to acknowledge the lead author of this brief, Michai Robertson, who unfortunately is closed. He's stuck in the negotiation room because he's the lead negotiator on this discussion for AOSIS. But yeah, very happy to continue this discussion with him as well. You have the QR code on the slide, so please feel free to download this or ask me later to send it to you via email. I'll be very happy to. As you can see on the slide, we cover a wide range of topics, and it also includes the mobilization of non-party stakeholders and the way they contribute to the discussion. So this will also be part of today's event, dividing into two roundtables, specifically one on the negotiation, and as I said, one other on the stakeholders mobilization. And we will be lucky enough to have Her Excellency Ilana Seid closing this event. Thank you so much for being here with us. But now, lots of talking, so let's move to this first round table. So I would like to invite our three first panelists to join me on the stage. So Sandip Sengupta, the Global Policy Lead on Climate Finance within the IUCN, Beatriz Granziera, Senior Climate Policy Advisor within Nature Conservancy, and last but not least, Torsten Thiele, the founder of the Global Ocean Trust. Thank you so much for being with us, and I think we can all give them a big round of applause to warm them up. And actually, I'm going to sit with you because it's a bit lonely here. Right. A few minutes to settle. Basically, I wanted to kickstart this conversation by asking one overarching, sorry, so hard to say for a French person, overarching question to all of us, which is where do we stand, in terms of the COP29 finance discussion, and how can we ensure the ocean benefits from this increase of good quality finance? And I'm going to start asking this question to you, Sandip. Can you please get us started?
All right. First of all, thank you so much, Marine, for helping bring us all together here and participating in this really important discussion. So your question is, where are we on finance, right? I mean, I think we all know that in a sense that this is meant to be the finance COP. Parties are supposed to reach an agreement on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance to replace, in a sense, $100 billion per year commitment that they had agreed to deliver by 2020, and which wasn't delivered by 2020. So in a sense, and it was also agreed back in Paris that a new goal would be established from the floor of $100 billion per year at this COP by 2025. So, as you know, the negotiations are actively going on precisely on this issue. I think it's fair to say that the parties are still very far apart. There are very divergent views on how much this new quantum should be, with ranges from the one end, ranging from the floor of $100 billion per year to figures like 1.1, 1.3 trillion thrown at the other end. So it's very, very complicated. I think also associated with this discussion is a contributor base. Who should be contributing towards this new collective quantified goal? So I hope that there is progress made during the course of these negotiations, but we'll have to wait and see. From our point of view in IUCN, we have called for the establishment of an ambitious new collective quantified goal on climate finance that covers the entire spectrum of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And in particular, we are mindful of the fact that in relation to adaptation financing, there is a big gap. The adaptation gap report, for instance, said that where adaptation financing needs to be is 18 times more than where it is right now, 10 to 18 times more than where it is right now. And then the final point that I'll make is that in relation to oceans, as you rightly pointed out, it's important that this bigger finance package for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, that addresses the needs of developing countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, that gets accepted. But within that package, of course, we are also conscious of the fact that, investing in the in our natural ecosystems provide concrete benefits for climate, both from an adaptation point of view and a mitigation point of view. So we are also arguing that there would be a need for greater climate financing to flow towards nature, and particularly to flow towards indigenous communities and local people, who are the custodians of our natural ecosystems. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandeep, for that. And I think an important point is really to recognize that we've been working, over the last 10 years all together from the ocean community to ensure that we recognize that climate action is ocean action, that there are two sides of the same coin. And it's really this that we want to carry forward in terms of the climate finance. It's about having more climate finance and making sure that ocean finance is climate finance. It's so much the same thing that I can make it to say it. But thank you so much for that. And I wanted to move now to Torsten to complement a bit of these elements and get your thoughts on the COP29 finance negotiations.
Great, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here amongst so many friends of the ocean. And I will focus a little bit on that first word in the title of our session, which is navigating. Because I think part of the challenge has been that as people look to deliver on this ambition, they haven't really focused enough on how these pathways work together. We need that much larger amount, but we don't necessarily need the much larger amount from the public finance space. If we can find pathways to bring much more significant private financing in the space. And we also need to make sure that as we deliver this finance opportunity, we deliver it to the places that need it the most. So it's the opportunity around addressing resilience and adaptation, particularly in small island developing states, in developing countries with significant coasts that are exposed to change, where the most immediate impact can be made. And this is where we have an initial problem coming from the traditional finance community, because when you finance mitigation, and that's why we have a lot of investment, for instance, in offshore wind, we have a clear tool to measure our outcomes. It's that additional unit of energy we produce renewably. All that is clearer. And so, in fact, when we wrote the discussion for the ocean panel paper around ocean climate finance, identifying that about a third of all climate finance solutions can come from the ocean, we found that in that space, the issue is less about the actual amounts of money and much more about the regulatory environments, the way risk transfers happen. How can we get that investment to the right kind of place? But when we talk about the adaptation, the resilience space, the coastal community space, and all the co-benefits parts that we already alluded to, whether they are from the biodiversity point of view, whether they are from a social point of view, the correct measuring mechanisms are key. And so as you address this avoided loss question, this huge opportunity to invest now so that you have much less damage later, you need an additional tool to take this assessment, which we can now do economically. We know the benefits from having functional coastal ecosystems to protect communities behind. We know all that assessment and making more progress economically, but it's not necessarily yet in the financial structuring. So we need ways to introduce that into the financial mechanics. And those tools about delivering price points around finance is where we need the common language. And so there are a number of really interesting entry points. So for instance, with the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, we've worked with the insurance industry because insurance can provide that type of pricing mechanism. Similarly, the work around identifying natural capital asset classes is a way of saying, here is a really important asset for a country that needs some investment to avoid further degradation, that investment needs to have a financial structure for that flow. And so when we came up with this paper, one of the first things in the paper was this focus on having concrete standards around ocean climate finance. And so that focus on how do we deliver these pathways and mechanisms so that we get to the much larger amounts, and so that the blended part, the public support part, the international contribution actually unleashes much more significant flows. And that's why we need these additional innovative finance tools. That's why we have this whole range of new opportunities around how to do impact measurements appropriately. So when we now talk about the sustainable blue economy, we're really talking about a sustainable and regenerative blue economy, measuring the positive impacts onto the marine ecosystems and for people as part of that overall assessment. And that allows us then to prioritize these ocean-related solutions. And so our argument is almost saying ocean initially looks as the more difficult pathway for investment. It actually is the stable, large pathway as soon as we overcome these initial hurdles of how to embed ocean solutions, how to do the correct pricing and measuring. And this is this significant common opportunity that we have.
Thank you very much, Torsten. A lot of very different and important elements on which we will come back on the second section, also discussing about the role of the private sector and the regulatory environments. But I really appreciate the fact that you touch also about the co-benefits and the fact that when we are to develop ocean policies and ocean measures in the way we finance them, it's also important to consider the mitigation, at the same time adaptation, but also conservation and sustainable development benefits. One other very important element was the metrics. And I think this is also around the discussion on accountability, which actually makes a perfect transition to Article 6. Bia, we're very happy to have our Article 6 whisperer with us. Can you explain us a bit about it and how it's connected to the finance discussion?
Thanks so much, Marine, and I must say I love that title, so thank you for that. I'm very happy to be here today, and I think, yeah, it's a very good segue from Torsten's presentation to talk about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And I feel that every time that I mention Article 6, I feel a little bit of anxiety in the room. Article 6 is very technical in an extremely complex topic. This is the 9th year of Article 6 negotiation, so a lot has going on, and I feel there is so much confusion in the space. But I think the question on Article 6 finance for oceans also applies to Article 6 finance in general is Article 6 operational, and how can Article 6 actually deliver finance for ocean-based solutions? So just to start with, what is actually Article 6? I like to see Article 6 as a tool that countries can use to cooperate between them to achieve their NDCs in the most cost-effective way possible. So if one country has overreached their NDCs, it could sell these units to another country so they can meet their NDCs in a more cost-effective way. There are two ways that countries can do that. The first one is through a mechanism called Article 6.2, so not a great name. Article 6.2 is based mostly on bilateral agreements. So it's a direct relationship between countries or between a country and a company to trade carbon credits. And because it's based on a direct relationship, countries have a lot of flexibility to decide what's going to be traded. So they could, for example, include mangroves projects, credits from mangroves projects as part of this transactions, and also include links with the private sector and with other compliance markets. And that's what we've been seeing from some of the countries that are implementing Article 6 already. The second mechanism is Article 6.4. It has a different approach. So while 6.2 is a direct relationship, 6.4 has a centralized UN body that is called a supervisory body that is going to make the decisions of what's going to be traded through Article 6.4. So they will adopt the methodologies, they will register projects, they will do everything to operationalize the mechanism. So on day one of this COP, we start with some big decisions on Article 6 that are important for operationalization. And I think that since day one, since these decisions happened, a lot of people come to me and say, "Yeah, what are you still doing here at COP? Like Article 6 is done, right?" And unfortunately, this is not true, but that's what we are expecting from this COP. So for this Article 6.2, for the direct relationship between countries, this is actually already ongoing and operational. So countries could make bilateral agreements to, for example, trade and carbon credits from blue carbon projects, for example. Right now, there's a lot of momentum around these types of bilateral agreements. There are dozens of bilateral agreements that have been signed. Some countries are authorizing this credits. It's the first authorization letters that are being issued. But in contrast, only one trade has happened so far. So I think this is it's a good illustration of how challenging it is for countries to implement the Article 6 frameworks and develop the projects that will be able to be traded. And for Article 6.4, countries are negotiating just across the room over there and in the other room. So we are going to see if that's going to be operational. But for Article 6.4, that supervisory body, that UN body is going to decide if blue carbon ecosystems could be included in as one of the potential sources of finance for Article 6. And I think there is a big advocacy to be done right now, not only for oceans, but also for nature in general. These discussions are going to happen next year, and I'm going to be following them. So happy to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Bia. And actually, I'm going to ask you directly a follow-up question to elaborate a bit on your expectations for this Article 6.4. And yeah, also, can you explain us a bit, and I'm sorry, I'm not an Article 6 nerd, but how this can benefit the NDCs on the long term? How can we take advantage of this? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I think this is an important question, actually, because Article 6 could benefit countries' NDCs in some cases, right? So Article 6 is not a mandatory program or tool, is a voluntary program. So it makes sense for the countries that consider carbon markets as a part of their strategies to meet their NDCs. What I think is interesting about Article 6 is that it can be a source of finance. It can attract international finance and also capacity building technology that wouldn't be available domestically otherwise. So what we've been seeing that a lot of countries are structuring their frameworks to use finance from Article 6 to reinvest in additional mitigation within their borders. So Article 6 could, in that sense, if well operationalized, be a way for countries to go and make more ambitious NDC targets. But of course, for that to happen, there's a lot of strategy that countries need to work on. Specifically for oceans, I think there's one point that brings a lot of confusion, that is nature part of Article 6? And my first question, I already touched on that. It is, but I think it's worth it to explain how that works, because this comes up a lot. So in the Article 6 rules, everything that is considered emission reduction or emission removal is considered as potentially part of Article 6 if, of course, other requirements of Article 6 are followed. So in that sense, blue carbon projects that result in an emission reduction or an emission removal, they could generate credits under Article 6, and with that benefit from markets finance. So in terms of expectations for this COP, I think the biggest one is that we're going to leave Baku with a fully operational Oracle 6. Again, as I mentioned in day one of COP29, we already made a lot of progress on important things, but there are still some very key issues that are being negotiated. So I think having countries agreed on transparent rules, on rules that can provide accountability, that is key to create a robust market. And I think that's the main thing that we are expecting, because with a robust market, you're actually going to increase finance that could be potentially used for blue carbon ecosystems.
Perfect. Fantastic, Bia. Thank you so much for making Article 6 so crystal clear for everyone. And perhaps building on these elements and going back to what you were saying, Sandeep, at the very beginning on how complex it is now to get more finance and how difficult it is currently in the negotiation rooms. Could you elaborate perhaps a bit more on IUCN's position that you mentioned, and really explain us what are also your expectations for these negotiations and how this could benefit blue NDCs? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Marine. I think it's important to step back for a second and just look at where we are right now. This last decade has been the warmest in the entire recorded history of temperature records, right? I mean, it's 1.2 degrees on average above pre-industrial levels. If we look at what the latest emission gap report tells us that our colleagues in UNEP released, all the NDCs taken together, take into account the implementation of the NDCs, all of that right now lead us to a world where of a temperature rise between 2.7 to 3.1 by the end of the century. So in a sense, if we look at where we should be and where we are, there is a big gap. Again, the UNFCCC NDC synthesis report that was just recently published shows that all the NDCs taken together reduce greenhouse gas emissions by only around 2.6% below 2019 levels by 2030, as against what the IPCC says it's required, 43%. So against 43%, we only have around 2.6%. So in a sense, this is the gap that needs to be bridged. And what is the way of bridging this gap? Right now, next year, we know all parties are required to submit, their next round of NDCs in support of the Paris Agreement. 10th February is a deadline. And in a sense, it's important that those NDCs are really ambitious. They really take on fully the spirit of the Paris Agreement that says that all future NDCs must be a progression on previous NDCs and reflect the highest possible ambition that countries have. And in a sense, that really needs to be facilitated through greater finance. So it's often linked, because a lot of these NDCs, especially from developing countries, they have a conditional component and an unconditional component. And the conditional component is dependent on the provision of more finance. And therefore, in that context, I think, and what I'd also like to stress is the urgency of the moment, because again, earlier this week, IUCN released the latest assessment of coral reefs under the IUCN Red List of endangered species, and it found that 44% of reef building coral species are currently threatened by climate change, and this is up from 33% in the last assessment that was carried out in 2008. And it's not just about coral reefs. It's about, understanding that coral reef ecosystems, support around 20%, 25% of all marine life. It's about looking at the linkages between, that and the livelihoods that coastal communities depend on, and it's really important, therefore, this need for ambition really be understood and taken on board seriously in the NDCs going forward. And from an IUCN perspective, so we are calling for more ambitious NDCs across the board, but we are also, as I said before, you recognize that this ambition has to take on board the messages from the global stocktake, a call for transitioning away from fossil fuels, a call for tripling renewable energy by 2030. Indeed, also recognizing the important role of nature and ecosystems. For the first time in the global stocktake decision last year, there was a clear call, a clear target established calling for ending and reversing forest loss and forest degradation by 2030. Signals have been sent in relation to the ocean, the global stocktake decision. What is it? Paragraph 36 6, I think, calls for, appropriate ocean-based mitigation action. Paragraph 56, I think, calls for, recognizes the role of oceans in building resilience. So these signals have been sent, and these signals now need to be taken up in the next generation of NDCs. The last point I'll make is, and this is in relation to oceans, that, and it's an important point, that while putting the ocean forward as a solution to the climate problem, we don't, how do I put this? We don't exaggerate the fact, because, we don't oversell the potential of the ocean as a carbon sink, because the very carbon that is absorbed by the ocean is also what is making it more acidic, warmer, and deoxygenated, right? So there's a distinction in the role that, in the carbon capture role that the ocean plays. It's a natural regulation is one function, but there are people out there who are, not wanting to take serious actions in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions through fossil fuels. They're looking at the ocean as a possible, silver bullet that can help address the problem. And it's important, I think, for us as a community not to fall within that trap, even while recognizing the important and highly valuable role that, oceans, coastal ecosystems, nature in general can play in addressing this problem. Thank you.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sandeep. It's very important to, as you say, replace the ocean in the overall context. And of course, we won't be able to achieve the Paris Agreement without drastic and urgent cuts of emissions. So this is, of course, the priority. And perhaps one thing that we haven't really touched upon, but I mentioned in the remarks earlier, is the need to diversify the ocean-based measures that are in the NDCs, because several organizations, conducted this analysis of NDCs, and what we really saw is that, yes, more than 70% of these NDCs include ocean-based measures, but most of the time they're blue carbon, ecosystem protection, or coral reef protection. And don't get me wrong, obviously it's very important. And as you said, it's connected to other objectives in terms of co-benefits, but it's also really important to go for other kind of measures that are also ocean-based, like tripling energy, you said. Well, the development of offshore wind energy should also be one of our priorities. And where we are now is, I think we also have good opportunities to make sure this transition of energy sectors or shipping transport sectors are also biodiversity positive, because now we know that if we have, for instance, marine spatial planning, that we'll have more responsible offshore wind and so on. So I think it's also important that we diversify the portfolio of solution, and that we make sure that we have more quantified measures as well, because a lot, I think, of the point of financing NDCs, making them, as we heard, often more investable, is making sure that we have clear, quantified, measurable targets to help us also carry action forward. So I think it's an important point for the financing. But yeah, moving on to the rest of the discussion, Torsten, if you were to wrap up a bit this first panel and share your thoughts on the next steps and the expectations for this COP29 in terms of finance.
Thanks very much. And I think to put this discussion into a wider finance context, where we are making progress, is that, for instance, on the blue carbon side, we now have high quality blue carbon principles and guidance. We have a common understanding emerging from both the corporate side and from a project developer side, what that means. So it does allow for finance flows in that direction. Similarly, on the blue bond side, we are making good progress in having a common approach. We have the ability for larger issuance in that space, and that actually opens up this world to the big asset owners, the large institutions, those types of investors who at the moment still are challenged to find the right fund flows into this world in an efficient, effective way. And that is really, I think, where the shift will take place. And as we arrange that shift, as we develop common language around it, we have an ocean investment protocol emerging. All these are efforts to allow these different constituencies to jointly engage in the space that UNFCCC provides and beyond that space. And that, I think, is the real opportunity that a coalition of the willing on finance can really drive this shift now. And so making progress on these individual items all helps, but it's part of that broader message and language that we are all working towards.
Perfect, fantastic. Is there anything you wanted to add, or otherwise we can perhaps take 10 minutes to ask some questions from the floor? Sound good? All right, I see hands in the back. Is it possible to get a microphone? Otherwise, we can speak very loud.
Thank you for your remarks today. I think it's been really insightful. A question I have is around how do you think about credits and international waters? Given that 2/3 of the oceans are international waters, how does that work?
Always love questions about BB&J because it shows an awareness that most of the planet really has its own legal regime. And now that we're about to have an international treaty for the high seas, hopefully ratified by the summer of next year, and then coming into force 4 months later, it is really important to use that framework. And in the context of that framework, there is a specific special fund proposition, and that special fund will be sourced and funded from a whole range of parties and partners. And that funding is in particularly targeted to allow capacity from everybody, including in particular developing countries, to participate in delivering the goals of the High Seas Treaty. And that includes large-scale marine protection. And so it'd be very interesting then to think beyond, and that's what your question is doing, as to whether at some point there will almost be refinancing mechanisms if we can account for the benefits that come from these interventions. But step one is to put that treaty into force. Step two is to use the finance mechanism that comes with the treaty to actually manage the high seas more effectively. And then steps three is thinking about, are there credit and revenue types of mechanisms? And I would, for instance, argue that the overarching ocean data infrastructure that will be put in place is not just a cost because it's necessary for better monitoring, verification, etc., but it's actually potential way to have additional use cases and revenues in terms of optimizing ocean use and charging ocean users. And you may have seen a paper earlier this week by Prime Minister Mia Mottley and President Macron talking about levies in that international space. So there are multiple ideas around potential sources of such funding. And I think putting it to good use for better high seas is a key opportunity.
I see we have another question from the floor. Thank you.
So yeah, following on the previous question and on your response, probably the most significant ocean user is international shipping, and I'm hearing a lot of talk about different financial mechanisms, and of course a financial mechanism is now being discussed at the International Maritime Organization, and my question is there coordination with the International Maritime Organization around how these mechanisms will work, how they'll interact, and how they'll be used?
Sorry, it's me again. I think that's exactly where we need to focus on. We need to understand these different ocean users and how the financial mechanisms that come up in each of these contexts get coordinated, operationalized, and made effective. So we've just come out of Cali, COP16. There is a DSI, Digital Sequence Information Financing Mechanism, on the back of that Cali decision. That is effectively a way to engage with the pharmaceutical industry as it uses the ocean. There'll be a fund coming out of that. You are absolutely right. The IMO Carbon Greenhouse Gas Fund will be a very significant amount of money. So coordinating the best use of that It's absolutely key. But I think there are other ocean users as well. So as we look at those, building up that financial ocean infrastructure is absolutely key and one of the things that I'm very focused on. Yes.
Perhaps just if you don't have to compliment, just flagging that there's also great efforts that are being made right now to align the financing under the Climate and the Biodiversity Convention. So it's conventions that are a bit closer than the IMO, but it's still some great work that is being implemented. We had at the beginning of the first week, if I remember correctly, a ministerial event actually on the state of finance for nature and climate, and really this idea of aligning the two. There's another paper that was published on the topic. It's called Blue Thread. It considers the different entry points for synergies, and there's this discussion on finance as well, and see how we can try to align between climate and biodiversity. So if this is helpful. Perhaps we can take a last one. I saw Mark, you had your hand, so please the last one, and then we'll close the panel. Thank you.
Via? Yes, please. Thank you. So one of the things that you had mentioned with respect to Article 6 was how it ties to carbon markets and financing blue carbon. But I was wondering if you could share any information on how Article 6 might also tie to other mitigation tools as they relate to ocean-based climate solutions. How does Article 6 interact with those other, or does it?
One question for you, what kind of tools are you thinking about?
Well, it could be, for example, decarbonizing shipping. It could be offshore wind energy. If there are ways in which it ties to some and not others, I'd also love to understand that.
Yes, absolutely. No, and this is a very good and challenging question as well. So I focus my presentation specifically on the nature part of Article 6, right? But you are completely right. Article 6 is open for all sectors. So land use, which includes coastal ecosystems as well, just one of them. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that markets in general need very strict standards and rules to generate carbon credits, right? I think what you don't want is to generate carbon credits without having the science behind that proves how much was actually mitigated. And I think more than that, you also need tools to address cases of, I don't know, reversals, if something happened afterwards, of leakage, and so on, and how to address safeguards, for example. How are you going to treat, for example, communities that are impacted by these mitigations activities? So all of that comes down to have methodologies and standards that are able to quantify all of that, to quantify how much mitigation you have, to provide safeguards both for the environment and for the society, for communities, for indigenous peoples, and so on, so that this carbon projects are not actually impacting negatively the environment and the communities. So yes, there are methodologies from all of these sectors. And I think it's interesting because when you're talking about a bilateral agreement through Article 6, right, but any bilateral agreement between countries, there is so much flexibility for the countries to decide what goes in there. Of course, Article 6 is the framework, so countries are going to have to follow the rules, and there are many rules to be followed. For example, I think one of the most important one is the whole discussion and concern about avoidable counting. And I'm not going to get too into the details here, but I think this is really the core of carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. If, for example, I don't know, Ghana, and I'm mitigating my emissions, I generate a carbon credit and I export that, then Ghana can no longer use this credit to meet their NDC, even if the credit was originated there. So I think this is also a very important thing. So I would say that as long as you have science to prove mitigation and these very strong rules, you could be part of market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement because they are open to all of them. When you go to this other mechanism, which is 6.4, that has a centralized UN body, they are going to decide what sectors are in. So as I mentioned, technically, every mitigation or every activity that results in a reduction or removal of GHG emissions could be part of it. But they are going to decide what methodologies are accepted. So it's going to be to this UN body, it's a UN technical body. It's the same negotiators there are in Article 6, but it technically legally is a separate body. They're going to decide what is in there. So nature could be there, but they are going to talk about many other sectors, including transport, energy, and that's where other types of mitigations that you mentioned could be in.
So I'll be very brief. I think, in approaching Article 6 or even ocean solutions in general, I think it's important to sort of make a distinction between, good acceptable solutions and non-acceptable solutions, and so I think even the global stocktake calls for appropriate ocean-based mitigation action, but it doesn't quite define what appropriate is. So, and therefore the application of Article 6, it's important that, the world doesn't incentivize sort of the wrong sorts of ocean solutions that can end up making the problem much worse. I'm thinking of, some of the geoengineering based solutions, ocean fertilization, et cetera. And the one additional point that I did want to make is, there are some interesting developments that are happening outside the UNFCCC process that have a direct bearing on how the ocean is being managed, right, in the context of climate change. I'm thinking here of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Seas, and the advisory opinion that they issued earlier this year, which classified greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide as a marine pollutant and called on, states to have certain obligations to address that. So in a sense, you cannot develop a market around a pollutant that makes the problem worse. In case it really helps, so offshore wind is one thing, it may be acceptable. Nature-based solutions may be one thing, but there may be other solutions which may be pushed by some vested interests, which may be bad for the ocean, bad for nature, bad for people, but that might still, if you're not careful, get through the mechanisms and be incentivized. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
No, thank you for pointing it out. And there's a strongly recognized portfolio of ocean-based solutions now that are positive for climate, nature, and biodiversity. Climate, nature, biodiversity, and people. That was the one. So I think it's important that we prioritize these solutions in terms of development, but investments, research, and all that. So thank you for putting that in context. I think it's very clear from this panel that ambition and finance are, again, two sides of the same coin. So thank you very much for putting your expertise on the table. And yeah, I think we can give them a big round of applause. So now I'm making the transition. We've discussed, how important it is to connect ambition and finance, making sure that we also build trust among countries, but also in the Paris Agreement itself, because finance is the crux of the discussion. And if we're to implement and reach the 1.5, we need to also believe in this. So now the discussion is more about what do we do next and how do we make sure that non-state actors are also an integral part of the discussion. And for that, I would like to invite our three next speakers. Chip Cunliffe from the Program Risk and Director from the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, Suzanne Jensen, Senior Advisor of the Ocean Stewardship Coalition of the UN Global Compact, and Sabrin Rahman, Managing Director, Head of Sustainability Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Turkey from HSBC. So please, could you take a seat with me? Thank you so much. And I think we can also give them a big round of applause to warm them up. I was actually yesterday, I don't know if some of you were there as well, but there was the Business Investments and Philanthropy Forum of COP 29, and Nigel Topping, who was the high-level climate champion for COP 26, was there, and he actually opened one of the roundtables saying that there is two COP going on in parallel, with one of governments following the negotiated items and the other one following the non-state actors' actions, their commitments, and the finance. So that's, his point was really about bringing these two words together, and that's what we're trying to do in this event. So the question that I wanted to ask all of you was about these non-state actors' commitment and how can the private sector increase this financial flow to also accelerate ocean-based solutions, including in the context of NDCs. So Chip, if you could get us started on this question and explain also the work that ORRAA does to facilitate this. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, and great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. So, a little bit better. Look, ORRAA is a multi-stakeholder organization, been running for 5 years now. We have a goal or a mission to reach to invest $500 million into coastal and ocean natural capital by 2030, and also to make 250 million climate vulnerable coastal people more resilient to the impacts of climate change and ocean risks by 2030 as well. Now, as I said, we're a stakeholder alliance, and we have over 100 members to date, some of which, of course, sit in or from the finance sector, and indeed are the private sector as well. So Deutsche Bank is our lead global banking partner. AXA is our lead global insurance partner. We have others from Bank of America and Standard Chartered through to, in fact, a whole load of others. UNDP is a great supporter of us, and indeed, a lot of the people probably in this room from CI, TNC, etc., are all part of that group. But what we are looking to do is to drive, as I said, that finance into the space. So we do so through a bottom-up approach. So we've currently invested into over 50 projects in the global south to date, and they include everything from carbon credits to small-scale or parametric insurance to small-scale fisheries. We are looking at, as Torsten talked about, blue bonds. And indeed, I think it's a really critical piece of the puzzle is us being able to deliver that from the bottom up. However, if we are to deliver to $500 million between now and 2030, we need to be looking at a top-down approach as well. And that's really where the financial institutions, that's where private finance really plays its part. So how do you invest that much money into the space where we know that there are certain barriers around private finance being driven into the ocean space? That's partly around a lack of ocean literacy, perhaps, not only within the financial institutions themselves, but also across the board. And I think that that's a really critical piece of the puzzle that we are looking to try to fix. But I'm also really sort of focused on how we de-risk some of that investment as well. So through the Sea Change Impact Finance Facility, so sort of called the SCIF, it's really an umbrella term under which we are looking to invest into these different areas. But one of the pieces of the puzzle that we're working on is the Nautilus Guarantee Facility. It's looking to guarantee investment into the sustainable blue economy, and set up by the same group actually that developed the Green Guarantee Company. And so it's a really critical piece of the puzzle, because if you're looking to drive finance into the space, you need that de-risking element. And so that's what that's doing. We're also working on a blue bond incubator, again, providing financial and capacity building for actors who are looking to develop blue bonds. And again, we're looking at a fairly significant amount of finance to be driven into the space through that too. But I think that one of the key pieces that we're also focused on is around data. So how does an investor, and indeed how does a policymaker or a government understand the importance of ecosystems on their coastlines. So we rolled out the Coastal Risk Index a couple of weeks ago in Cali. Now, the Coastal Risk Index is a tool that allows policymakers, investors, and other stakeholders to understand the risk reduction value of ecosystems, more specifically coral reefs and mangroves. Now, if you can determine the risk reduction value of a mangrove or a coral reef, then you're then able to put a price on that ecosystem. If you're able to put a price on that ecosystem, you're then able to invest in that ecosystem more effectively. So the CRI has determined that $363 billion worth of flood risk reduction takes place every year through the fact that you have healthy ecosystems on the coast. And 14.9 million people are also protected by those ecosystems. In Colombia, more specifically, a fact that I obviously was talking about when I was in Cali was that $4.2 billion worth of flood is likely on an annual basis. But mangroves and reefs reduce that flood risk by 1.2 billion, so it reduces it by half. If you're an asset owner that has an asset that sits behind those ecosystems, you're incentivized to manage that ecosystem more effectively. And indeed, if you're a government and you have populations that live along the coastline that either sit beside or behind those ecosystems, you're also incentivized to protect and manage that further. And maybe the last thing I'll say is just around something called Vessel Viewer. Vessel Viewer is a tool that we've developed with the insurance industry in mind to better understand, almost as a carrot and stick effect, whereby you're able to showcase to the insurers the likelihood of fishing vessels being involved in IUU fishing. Now, that is a pervasive problem, massively costs $20 billion a year to the industry, has massive impacts on local populations in coastal countries. And what the Vessel Viewer is doing is helping insurers to determine the likelihood of a vessel being involved in illegal fishing. It's illegal for an insurer to insure fishing vessels that are linked to IUU. So it's a really critical tool that we feel that the insurance industry can utilize to better understand the risk that they themselves are likely to be under, but also to reduce IUU fishing impacts as well.
Thank you, Chip. Indeed, it's a lot about raising awareness about the risk, and thank you for bringing up the Coastal Risk Index. I think it's a very important and innovative tool where we can really shift this kind of problem and really help raise awareness. Moving to you, Sabrin, I'm actually quite curious about how a bank gets involved in that kind of landscape and how a group like HSBC can contribute to this.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. So I'm here to share a little of what we've been doing around nature more broadly, and more of the last few years, what we've been doing around the blue economy. To Chip's point around literacy and understanding, I think it's fair to say that was probably one of the biggest gaps in the financial services sector. And it's the same pathway we've been through when looking at how to really integrate green investments a decade ago. It was the same conversations we had around nature several years ago and what we're going through when it comes to social inequality, equity. How do you price that? How do you measure it? How do you start quantifying something that is so different across borders? And when it comes to the blue economy, there is so much sort of international jurisdiction that you overstep on when trying to quantify it. So for us, we've been focusing on two main things. Number one, really helping to scale the understanding and the ecosystem development within our sector. So for example, we've been working very closely with the International Capital Markets Association on blue bond standards and principles. So essentially, how do we ensure there is uniformity in understanding across borders when issuing blue bonds, not green bonds. And that's been an incredibly interesting journey for us because it has allowed us to also confront some of the gaps perhaps we may have. So as HSBC, we're one of the world's largest financial institutions. We have millions of customers and many business lines, right? So we've got investment banking, commercial banking, asset management. So you can imagine how difficult it can be to ensure that these are not only appropriately priced from a risk and credit perspective, but also a commercial opportunity perspective. So our asset management team have really been leading the way on their investment framework and how they approach a lot of the blue finance and blue economy opportunities. But also what we've done in 2023 is ensured that our net zero transition plan, which is really the how we get to the commitments that we had made, had a very strong focus on nature that was integrated. So we didn't want it to be a standalone, which then makes it difficult from a governance and regulatory perspective to quantify and to communicate. So we've made it a core part. It is something we report on and something we will continue to work on. We also work very, very closely with the Sustainable Markets Initiative. So with many of our peer groups to really start defining all the different transaction opportunities and definitions around coastal communities, coastal projects, ocean projects, fisheries, and so forth. And we're working with, I believe it's Canopy, Global Canopy, to publish the Little Black Book for Nature. Again, for transactions that are not just blue bonds, right? There are so many transactions that happen at different levels. And in fact, HSBC Australia, as well as the Australian government last year, or a few years ago actually, also purchased reef credits. So it was one of the first transactions that really started to incentivize farmers and graziers who were ensuring that the sediments from their soil didn't affect and impact water bodies around. So there's a lot of innovative ways that I think once the literacy is there and the will is there and the governance and that ecosystem starts moving, all of these players can come together because there are incredible partners such as Green Collar, who we worked with in Australia, Pollination, who we've worked on various funds. I think the world is absolutely open to really do that. As of last year, we've allocated about $340 billion as HSBC Group to sustainable financing projects that look at all spectrums. And it's something that we're looking to scale up more significantly in partnership. But I think that's just one way that we are supporting. Also on the mangroves, we also sit on the mangrove, for the mangrove breakthrough, we sit on their financial task force as well to again talk about the importance of coastal protection, but also to really start looking at the value of the carbon that can be sequestered from such projects and so forth. So I think we're taking steps in the right direction. The momentum is absolutely building up post COP28, as you mentioned, with that level of political will that we're seeing on ocean. But also I think the private sector has been making great strides in the last 5-6 years, even before a lot of that political will was there because of the urgency of the need.
Thank you very much, Sabrin, for sharing all the work that it's hard, the acronym in English, HSBC does to protect and to encourage the protection of nature. Thank you also for raising the case of the mangrove breakthrough. I think it's also a very important tool to really capitalize and make sure that both non-party stakeholders and governments are going in the same direction to ensure the protection of these very important ecosystems. So thank you for that. Moving now to you, Suzanne, to ask you also about, the work that you do within the UN Global Compact, the type of actors. I mean, we had a question on the IMO. I know you're working a lot with shipping companies. So can you also tell us about your work?
Thank you so much, Maureen. Yes, I'm with the UN Global Compact, and that's the institution within the UN that deals with industry, markets, financial players, and really tries to translate out the goals of the UN into the private sector. And it was very exciting to listen to Sabrin talk about, what was it, like almost $350 billion that you've committed towards sustainable capital and sustainable capital investment, which is incredible. And also that you're recognizing that the ocean economy and ocean investment is a significant part of that. So that's really something. But, at the Global Compact, we look at the $200 trillion of financial assets that's controlled by the big investors and also industry in terms of CapEx. It's pension funds, asset managers, companies, and what can we do to engage that, to start shifting funds towards a more sustainable ocean economy? And I would agree with Sabrin and Chip that that the lack of awareness about the ocean economy and the ocean as being an investable theme and the vital role of the ocean in our lives from the financial sectors and also from the corporate sector is probably one of the biggest hurdles that we are facing. So I think it's a unanimous platform on that. I think one of the ways that we need to start working is to help create very visible investment thesis for companies and for investors. And probably in this room, we've heard of that quantum. WWF looked at it, that the value at risk, if you look at publicly traded companies who are, there's $8.4 trillion value at risk across the universe of publicly traded companies for being exposed to bad practices within the ocean economy. You start to change some of those practices in industry and in companies, you take away $5 trillion. So you're down to $3 trillion at risk. When you talk to private investors, starting to quantify things, that resonates and that starts to get them interested. And, there's now, as this COP turns towards adaptation and what to do about it and how to finance it, they're starting to look at, for $1 put into 10 different countries on adaptation, particularly on island states, that gives to $12 of avoided harm. So investors are starting to tune in to the quantum of savings and managing risk that comes from investing in the ocean economy. But what we're looking at is we're trying to help support the creation of a blue capital market. And we actually are at an inflection point because we're starting to make progress. So a few years ago, we looked around and said, well, really, people, there perhaps is an intuitive gut feeling by the large investors that investing in the ocean space, is a good way to make impact. But it's hard, actually. They don't have the ready set of investments, and so the big investors don't necessarily feel like finding somebody else on the team to create yet another framework for going into ocean investments thematically. So we want to make it easier for them. We got together with the International Capital Markets Association, along with 3 other international institutions, to create the Blue Bond Framework. Understanding that if we can define what constitutes blue or what constitutes good in the ocean economy, then we'll start to get for example, the creation of bonds. And why we like bonds is because bonds shift funds at scale. They start to create the building blocks of a market, and then that creates the way for smaller investments to start coming in. So we're focused on that almost for its headline potential. We've seen in terms of where we are in the big blue market, is we've seen a number of really important blue bond issuances. We've been working with corporates, for example, like Ørsted, which is the offshore renewable company, to create an offshore wind blue bond. There was a Brazilian wastewater company owned by Brookfield that created some bonds. So the French water company has created a blue bond, but there's a whole slew of others that we're working with. The exciting part is, working with some of the large asset managers like T. Rowe Price and now Fidelity, that they're creating blue bond funds. And so this is an exciting part of looking at these two enormous players in the trillions in the markets, setting up funds to say, okay, this is an investable space. We like what's happening in shipping decarbonization. We know that we have to 3 times renewables, and offshore renewables will play a big part of that, et cetera. So let's create a bucket within our investment universe that we can start to put financing towards, ocean companies. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in the room, because we all work together, we work together all the time. And I think collectively we can start to push the ambition and the momentum to start to fill these buckets. It's certainly not an end stop if those big funds when they fill their buckets, but it will take the breath out of our sails if these funds, who are kind of taking a leap of faith to try to set up a new blue capital market, can't fill them. So what we need to start doing is we need to start supporting a pipeline of investable products within the ocean space. Oh gosh, I could go on and I could go on and on to talk about how we do that, but I want to stop, because I think collectively, looking around the friends in the room, I see that whether or not we're sovereigns, whether or not we're focused on corporates, whether or not we're focused on financial institutions, and whether or not we're focused on civil society and multilateral development banks and insurance, we can do it. And I think we can actually make some progress in terms of issuances by the UNOC, the UN Ocean Conference in June, and certainly by next COP. So when we're here next year, let's talk about what we've done.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And we will have Excellency Seid closing with the UN Ocean Conference also, and providing some remarks on that. But thank you so much, and also for bringing this idea of working all together. I think this is a very important point, and that brings me to my second question to all of you, which is how do you work with governments? I mean, some of you already touched a bit upon that, but how can we make sure that the private sector better work with the government and really support their objectives? So Chip, again, if you could kick us on that, that would be perfect.
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, look, I think that governments are a key and a crucial piece of, or provide a crucial a key to unlocking private sector investment, not surprisingly. The grant funding that ORRAA has received from the UK, Canada, and the US governments have been from the ODA, I think is a really sort of key and critical key to unlock at least the focus on developing the resilience to those coastal people that I've talked about already. But also, how do we utilize the private sector to do more, or utilize the governments to get the private sector to do more? And I think that we already know that HSBCs and the Standard Charters and Deutsche Banks, etc., of the world are focused on this, not just from in a talking shop, but actually doing the do, actually sort of action on the ground. Which, if we are to turn the dial, that obviously needs to move quicker. Governments can provide the regulatory environment for that to happen, and I think that with that you can unlock the blended finance that's required to move the millions to the billions in this space. Some of the work that we've been doing, or indeed, I think what we're obviously keen to do, is to bring the private sector and the governments together. And indeed, twice a year we have a funder advisory board. So any organisation that provides funding of over it's $1 million, I think it is, into ORRAA every year, they get to sit on the funder advisory board. Now that provides a forum through which both governments and philanthropies and the private sector can get on the same page to understand the sort of needs and requirements and the priorities and focuses that they each have, and then start to develop solutions to some of the problems that we've identified. And we also have something called a solution knowledge network. So within ORRAA itself, as I said, we have over 100 members. We can utilize that membership really to start to drive and to answer some of the questions that our stakeholders have, including the government. So I think that, that just ORRAA being in itself a stakeholder organization allows for those conversations to happen. And then, I think, I know, Ilana sort of sitting here, and Palau is one of our first SIDS to have joined ORRAA alongside Fiji and the Maldives and Sri Lanka. It's a really critical piece of our puzzle is understanding the needs and requirements of SIDS. We're focused solely on driving finance into SIDS and coastal least developed countries. And so having a seat at the table, understanding what we need to do and engaging the private sector is part and parcel of our everyday programming. So that's how we work with governments.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chip. And thank you for also building on what Torsten said at the beginning, like providing the regulatory environment, talking also about blended finance. So thank you for that. I think it's echoing pretty great. I actually want to ask the same question to you, Suzanne, and elaborate also a bit on this relationship between public and private sector.
Thank you. Well, a couple of things. One is, I think at the Global Compact, that's what we do. We bring together governments with the private sector and other stakeholders to start to create to advance a conversation around mutual goals. And we work very closely with the multilateral development banks, but certainly governments. And after working with, the 5 biggest decision-making stakeholders in the ocean economy space, from investment, meaning governments, multilateral development banks, and insurance, and corporates, and finance, we realized that there's, things tend to be looked at, from the respective stakeholder vantage points. So something called the Ocean Investment Protocol was created, and about 50 institutions have created a draft and are looking for other parties, institutions to come in to it and comment on it, including especially governments. We did it for the hopefully gift of the high-level panel on the sustainable ocean economy. And but what this does is it creates a set of top 5 to 10 recommendations by stakeholders of how they what they can do to unlock private capital. And to your point on and this creates almost a connective web. It's not individual, it's rather how they interact with each other. And I think that goes to interacting with the governments, because their role is to create an enabling ecosystem so that the private finance and private capital can come into that. And some of those recommendations for governments are things that you don't necessarily equate directly with finance. For example, looking, defining ocean finance as climate finance, but also putting a priority on creating sustainable ocean plans at a country level, because once you have the sustainable ocean plans, underneath that you have marine spatial planning, then you start to create some transparency and visibility for investors and private capital to see what are a country's plans longer term within this ocean economy space. Yeah, I'll stop there, but I would like to talk a little bit more about maybe since we touched on NDCs earlier, so maybe if we come back on what we can do to help governments and parties make them more investable, so that we can bring in the private sector through this process that's happening. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. No, but because we were talking about earlier how vital it is especially on the next round of NDCs, that they become, I think you said, more specific, and it's true. If we look at it, I'll take one sector as an example, which is the offshore renewable sector. If you take some of the countries and some of the markets where offshore renewables has taken off, for example, in the US, it's had some big problems in terms of the incentives that that particular government has set, not matching the realities of what the companies are facing, and some of this really could have been avoided. So we have a smoother, more nature positive scale up of renewables. So how does that translate into something like the NDCs? Well, first of all, you know, for companies and for investors, having transparency and clarity and visibility, dependability is like gold dust. And did I already say that? I don't know, but it is. And without that, you know, volatility and risk that you can't manage, it dampens deal flow. And that's what we want. We want deal flow, and we want significant CapEx decisions made for long periods of time. So from the NDC perspective, looking for NDCs that are specific, we would recommend countries identifying what are the in the case of renewables, what are the specific sectors, for example, that they want to set targets in. But this could be so something as high as buildings, renewables, EVs, et cetera. And then going down a little bit further to technology specific targets. So within renewables, you know, what is the specific type of perhaps technology or battery, or, you know, what are your overall targets? And that starts to allow companies in the markets to look at, to say, aha, this, you know, this country is, you know, very interested in creating such and such a market. But then underneath that, it's really to get even a step further, because to help to identify what are the mechanisms that, for example, a government would want to use in the case of offshore renewables to incentivize this type of activity. So that could be auctioning, you know, auctioning the lots, or permitting, and, you know, to give a little picture of what governments are willing to do within that space. And then that gives it back to the markets to say, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. Or where there's a gap, we see that, you know, there's some going to be some, we need to get some sort of development funding, et cetera. But it starts to allow them to make CapEx decisions that are big, that have decades long implications, but to be able to see that a country is behind planning a market. And we have a plan for that we can share.
Thank you, Suzanne. This is very helpful. And whether it's NDCs, but also SOPs, I think they can really act as the roadmap to guide us and help us really coordinate and collaborate between the private and public sector. So thank you for that. Going back to you, Sabrin, I wanted also to ask you to share a bit about your experience with the COP28 presidency, how you supported, and what this means in terms of public sector and private sector engagement. Thank you.
Sure. Before I do that, I'll just quickly touch upon two things that we've spoken about, which is around managing risk and ensuring a pipeline of bankability projects. And the reason why I wanted to quickly discuss that is because we've faced that, right, when it comes to energy projects around the just transition, sort of the JET piece, the just energy transition platforms across 4 countries, where HSBC and a slew of other partners have been ready to invest, but there was just that pipeline just wasn't there in a sort of rapid way. And what really was a learning is that countries, governments do need that support in understanding how to identify these projects, to have that sort of capacity building amongst their ranks, and their broader sort of private sector as well. And that's also something that we, as the larger financial institutions, have a responsibility to help develop. And so that's something, you know, that I think we've been doing very, very strongly. So in fact, the collaboration with the international capital markets with ICMA has yielded a fantastic issuance of the first public bond on the blue economy from Indonesia last year. It raised $150 million. So, and that was, the work that all of these partners have done to really start defining standards has been helpful, especially if we talk about capital allocation and mobilization in emerging markets. We need to understand the further support that's required, right, to really construct these things. And the second thing is around joint ventures. So we've also done 2 joint ventures that I think has helped also de-risk ventures and sort of projects, especially for international investors. One is with Pollination, really on sort of coastal and climate and nature projects that have that positive ecosystem services angle. And I've forgotten the other one, but we've done 2. So I think with Temasek on Pentagreen, which is really on sustainable infrastructure. Again, it was something that international investors were very, very scared to touch in emerging markets. And we're like, look, if we come in as an anchor investor or a partner, will that help? And it does help. So that's just 2 ways that I think that level of collaboration with governments and other sectors can help. So for those who don't know my background, I have just left the COP28 presidency, where I was seconded from HSBC to lead on private sector mobilization and really to ensure that the efforts that are happening in the periphery are really considered. And it's not part of the negotiated process, but it's really to scale to ensure there's coordination and that communication between our negotiators and people like us who are having these fantastic practical conversations to some of the biggest problems out there. In fact, we were the ones who developed the business and at that time philanthropy forum last year, so which the COP29 presidency is continuing, we're happy to see. And that was a platform we had created to really bring in the big philanthropies, the big private sector players, but also SMEs and a lot of the amazing civil society actors that we have. So I think the thing that I'd like to end with is that I think there's a lot of pros and cons with any COP process and so forth. But what's been very encouraging is the openness to start engaging with non-state actors as the practical solutions providers, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are responsible for scaling the ambitions of an NDC. So to really be part of that process from the start.
Thank you, Sabrin. Indeed, I think it's really important also here to acknowledge, and the Global Stocktake did it as well, the role of the high-level climate champions in really driving the leadership for non-state actors. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions because we're running a few minutes late. So I just would like to invite everyone to give them a big round of applause and thank all panelists. Thank you very much for diving deeper into the private sector and I would like now to invite Her Excellency Ambassador Ilana Seid from Palau to provide some closing remarks. Actually, I was listening to your president this morning in another side event that he really, talked about the mobilization of the Pacific countries since COP23 and really led on, the need for more ocean space in the UNFCCC. So thank you for that. Thank you for championing this topic. Yeah. And thank you also for the role you're playing in the UN Ocean Conference, but you're going to tell us a bit more about this. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you, Marine, for having me. Just a little bit of background. My name is Ilana Seid. I'm the ambassador of Palau to the UN, but I also have a couple of other hats. I'm the Sherpa co-chair for the Ocean Panel. The Ocean Panel is currently 19 countries that control 50% of the territorial oceans of the world. I'm also the co-chair of the steering committee of the Blue Economy and Finance Forum, and I'm one of the negotiators here at the COP. This is my 4th COP, so I cover oceans and climate. So I definitely agree with what Marine said before, which is ocean action is climate action. Just wanted to kind of roll us back to the Glasgow COP. When we were negotiating that outcome, the Pacific Islands, most notably Fiji, was really championing making people aware that the ocean is an integral part of the climate solution. Surprisingly, and I'm from a Pacific island, so the ocean is very much part of our day-to-day and our livelihoods, but that's not the case in many parts of the world. So when we had to educate people that the ocean is the largest carbon sink, it produces oxygen, it absorbs much of the heat. Many people didn't know that. And so I think that's one of the things that we are continuing to advocate. The Climate Ocean Dialogue was held in December of 2020. That was the first time that dialogue was held. And since then, we've seen that the advocacy for the ocean is continuing to build, and we're getting a little bit of momentum, but we need to keep it ongoing. So what are some of the things that we can do here? We can continue to advocate that some of the outcomes from the Climate Ocean Dialogue are incorporated into the decisions that are made at the COP, advocating for countries to incorporate oceans into their NDCs. I think that's also a key thing that we have to work on. At the Ocean Panel, not many of our country members, and again, recognizing that they control half of the territorial oceans of the world, have incorporated the oceans into their NDCs. So there is an advocacy component, and then there's also an implementation component. So that's something we're working very hard on at the Ocean Panel. But part of that also has to do with unlocking finance. So SDG 14, which is the SDG for the oceans, life below water, is currently the most underfunded of all of the SDGs. And that's part of our work. Suzanne's part of our steering committee as well for the Blue Economy and Finance Forum, is really to unlock financing for the ocean. So I think getting the framework right, getting the language right in these COP negotiations is kind of step one. It then leads the international community to understand the direction we're going. So if the international community acknowledges that the ocean is a big part of the solution, all the multilateral funds like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, can then have those board meetings that will allocate money to blue projects. And that will then catalyze more movement in the private sector. And I think that's really key. This COP is a finance COP, as we know, and I think the quantum of NCQG is going to be very important because it sets the direction of how ambitious we can have NDCs next year. So if we have an ambitious outcome this year, that's our budget. So we can have a large, ambitious outcome for the level of NDCs that we can have for mitigation next year. And hopefully a lot of those NDCs will incorporate ocean solutions. And I think the great thing about a lot of ocean solutions is that they are biodiversity positive, they help climate, and then they're also good for a lot of small island developing states. Small island developing states collectively control 30% of the territorial oceans of the world. And currently we're getting 2% of all climate finance. So you can see that there's a lot of inequity there, but we are also, I think, we can be a large part of the solution. So I think that's one of the key messages that we have. We have to have these things build upon each other. But we also have to make note that we need to incorporate the private sector, that there's a limited amount of public finance. There are competing priorities. So we need to be creative. We need to have an NCQG that is ambitious, but then we also have to go and work. I think you had mentioned the people who are actually doing the work. So for all of us to come together and say, well, we have an NCQG, we have kind of a baseline. How do we then use that to then capitalize a lot of the other sources of finance that will lead us to more climate ambition? So that's kind of part of the work we're doing for the Blue Economy and Finance Forum. So just to socialize that will happen right on the margins of the UN Ocean Conference next year in June. It will be held in Monaco, but that's really kind of to catalyze ocean finance. And if we catalyze ocean finance and we catalyze biodiversity positive ocean finance, that will also hopefully help solve a lot of the climate issues that we have going forward. I think I'll just bring one kind of concrete example, which Suzanne had mentioned. There's a lot of really interesting momentum in the shipping sector. So the greening of the shipping sector, some might call it green, some might call it blue, but it is an ocean-based industry, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of the shipping companies understanding that the COP has decided we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, want to make that transition, but there's not enough fuel. And the fuel producers are saying they have the ambition to create the fuels, but the finance sector is dragging behind because they are kind of emerging technologies. And so I think that's where we kind of have to all work together. The signals are there, and now we have to kind of work within our forums to connect all the dots so that hopefully, if we green shipping, it's the 8th largest carbon emitting body if it were a country. And so I think that would go a long way to helping us reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I will end it at that, but thank you so much for having us, and hopefully we can have a very successful COP that focuses on a lot of the blue solutions this year. Thank you.